Well, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. So we are picking up this week, still kind of in the middle-ish of the Exodus story itself. We left off where the Israelites were about to go to actually leave Egypt and go through the sea and into the wilderness. So, again, kind of what I have been thinking about as I've been reading through, particularly this story, but kind of the Torah in general this year, is kind of like, what is this teaching us about God's character? And how he relates to humanity. And there's a lot in this portion. I actually really like this portion. I went back and was reading some notes from some previous years of looking at this portion, and I kind of like because of course they come out of Egypt, they go through the sea, and then they get into the wilderness, and we kind of have this series of complaining and providing from the Lord with water and manna and all these things. And I think there's some really interesting things in there. So we'll just kind of jump in and see where we go. So we'll start at the beginning. We start in the portion starts in Exodus 13, verse 17. And we mentioned a little bit last week that we start to see some military language with Israel toward the end of last week's portion. I think it said that they went up. At the end of chapter 12, they went up. It says that Adonai brought Bnei Israel out of the land of Egypt as armies, and then here in chapter 13, in the beginning of this portion, in verse 18, and Bnei Israel went up out of the land of Egypt armed. And so we're starting to see some of these references to Israel having some military power. And of course, we know that they have plundered the Egyptians as they've gone, because they've gotten to the point where it's gotten so bad for the Egyptians where they are now asking them to leave instead of Moses kind of going before Pharaoh and pleading to go out into to worship for a few days. Now the Egyptians are like, you need to get out of here. Things are not going well for us, which, that much death that they've experienced will do that. And so they're giving them all these things as they're leaving, basically. And God has told them to ask for gold and silver and all these things as they're leaving. So they're leaving with some wealth, not to mention all of their livestock and things like that. So we're starting to see the language is shifting here. So we're starting to see reference to armies, and we're seeing reference to Israel as like a nation of people versus a family, which we've kind of seen happen because, of course, they have multiplied greatly in the land of Egypt. So they are far more numerous than they were before when it was just Jacob's family going down initially for about 400 years before then.
Can I ask you something? Mm-hmm. When God tells them, make sure you take the silver and gold, all that. Was precious metal used as a currency for just regular folks?
I would think so on some level. I think as much as they probably had access to it was. I think there was probably a lot of trading of not precious metals as well, other resources and goods and things like that. But I think precious metals were the currency of the day. So I think as much as they had access to it, the lower classes probably didn't have a lot of it.
No, probably not.
But I think as much as they had access to it, it was the currency as much as they had.
How much value this could have had for most of them, since you're not going to buy a loaf of bread with silver and gold.
Yeah. I still think it's valuable because as slaves, I don't think that they probably had a lot of this, because that gets into like where I don't think that they had a lot of like monetary wealth. They had their livestock and things like that, which was something the Egyptians looked down upon or didn't like, depending on how you're looking at it. But but they're being, which comes in later when they're talking about when they're accusing Moses basically of bringing them out just to starve to death. Is that comes up that we had all this meat and all this bread and all these in Egypt, is that when you're a slave, at least in their issue, that this type of slavery, their meals are provided for. Like they don't have to go to the store and buy food necessarily. They're slave masters. That is part of the providing for them that they were doing at least. So at least they were fed, which is so having to figure out this food situation was a new thing. But so yeah, I don't know that they had a lot of the monetary wealth. So I do think it was valuable. But yeah. So okay. So jumping into this parting of the sea story, of most of which is in Exodus 14. We know that they have the pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. So this manifest presence of the Lord leading them. And there's this interesting, it starts out with this kind of interesting situation where they go and the Lord doesn't take them like the most logical route maybe, or the quickest route, which would have been on like the main Egyptian thoroughfare, like that was used for travel and trading at the time. So the Lord's like, let's not go on the Egyptian road here. Let's go a different way. But it makes it appear to the Egyptians that they're just wandering. Chapter 14, verse 3, Pharaoh will say concerning Bnei Israel, they are wandering aimlessly in the land. The wilderness just shut them in. So this is kind of the Lord's plan, maybe, of tricking or making Pharaoh think that they don't know where they're going, they don't know what they're doing, so he can go catch up to them and bring them back. And so, which is exactly what he does. So he's like, oh, I can go, because he's now regretting that he's let them go. So he gets his army and they go and pursue. And Israel is understandably quite afraid of this Egyptian army pursuing. So they are crying out to Moses. And so in verses 10 through 14 is when they're basically saying, have you taken us away to the wilderness to die because there were no graves in Egypt? And so now they're saying, why did you do this? We would have just served the Egyptians. And initially, if you remember back to before all the plagues started, when the Lord is telling Moses, you're going to go and tell the people of Israel, I'm going to send these plagues on Pharaoh. I'm going to harden his heart, and I'm going to deliver you from these people. The people are basically like, they're basically, they're kind of complaining and protesting against this, which is playing into, it says, because they said back in chapter 6, that they did not listen to him because of their broken spirit and cruel bondage. So they're not really hearing this great promise of deliverance. They're like, what are you talking about? And so this is feeding into, at that point was feeding into Moses' fear that the people weren't going to listen to him. So at this point, though, the situation seems to be a little bit different because Moses responds kind of differently. They're not, this isn't so much a complaint of, it's not so much a complaint as this manifestation of fear, which is understandable as they've just come out and then they have this massive army and all these chariots coming after them. And so Moses is kind of understanding that, which is then we have kind of, this famous line in verse 13, but Moses said to the people, don't be afraid, stand still and see the salvation of Adonai, which he will perform for you today. You have seen the Egyptians, but you will never see them again, ever. Adonai will fight for you while you hold your peace. And so he's kind of, at this point, he's reassuring them because he's understanding that they are just afraid.
At this point,
exactly. Right. It's understandable. And really, and this is one of the things I think is so interesting about this portion. Because looking back and reading it now, we're like, how could they complain? How could they doubt and all these things? But it actually makes a lot of sense. So like in this situation, you have this huge army coming after you. It's understandable that they're afraid. And so Moses is reassuring them at that point. Because Moses' faith has been built up. Because if you remember kind of the pattern that you see, or the trajectory, I guess, that you see through the plagues, is that he starts out going to Pharaoh, because the initial requests, right, are to just go worship for a few days, to leave for a few days and come back. And he kind of makes this plea, and then he grows in confidence as he approaches Pharaoh as it goes through, because he's seeing what the Lord is doing. To the point where at one point when Pharaoh asks him, who's going to go, he's like, we're all going, and we're taking all of our animals. And Pharaoh's like, no. But at that point, the reality is that Moses is his faith in that the Lord is going to do what he said has grown. And so at this point, Moses' faith is high. The rest of the people are still a little bit like, this is terrifying, which again is understandable, because it's this process of building relationship. And another thing we'll see that I like about this is I see this as very much like a fathering relationship and building trust with the people, because the people as a whole haven't experienced this great power and relationship with the Lord like Moses has had.
A working relationship.
Yeah. Moses has had some more interaction with the Lord. So he's a little bit further along in the process, which is why this kind of works and why Moses is, it's kind of how this plays out. But anyway, so we'll keep going. So Moses is reassuring them as they're standing there at the sea with all the kind of feeling a little bit trapped, which makes a lot of sense. And of course, then the Lord instructs Moses to lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it. And then Israel's going to go through on dry ground. And then I have these verses that I love. In verse 19 of chapter 14, it says, then the angel of God who went before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them. Also the pillar of cloud moved from in front and stood behind them. And so between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel, there was a cloud and the darkness over there, yet it gave light by night over there. Neither one came near the other all night long. So we kind of have this picture of this protecting fire cloud, I guess, angel of the Lord, manifest presence of God, kind of standing between them. And it seems like there's different interpretations of this. I was reading a few different things, which was really kind of interesting. But we don't need to get into all of that. To me, it seems like this pillar is standing between them, providing light to the Israelites and keeping the Egyptians in darkness.
But are you saying that the angel of God and the pillar is the same thing?
Yes.
Interesting. Okay.
That's kind of so there's some different interpretations, but it does seem like because it's this angel of the Lord, phrasing there that is like that this is the kind of pre-incarnate Yeshua figure that we see throughout the Torah. And so this present, yeah.
Is there any other mention of the angel of God in this story?
I don't think in this story.
Okay.
I feel like I don't remember. I'd have to go look. I feel like as they go further, there's some intermittent references.
Okay. I get that the angel of God is interpreted as the pre-incarnate Yeshua, but it's confusing to me that he would be manifesting as the pillar of fire here, especially because, like, I read a couple of different translations because this part stuck out to me. Like, it says, then the angel of God who went before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them. Also, the pillar of cloud moved.
Yeah.
Seems like two distinct.
So. Yeah, and so there's some different ideas about this, and it's that
it does say chapter 13 verse 21. Adonai went before them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light.
Yeah.
So there's another one. Brings more confusion.
Right. So there's a couple of possibilities. It could just be because however you look at how this practically plays out, the pillar is from the Lord.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
And so the question is this manifest presence. And so it could just be kind of I don't know, I hate to just call it creative writing, but it could just be like the for the drama of the story, the way that it's recorded.
Yeah.
Is that God is in the pillar,
yeah.
or God is with the pillar at this point, or whatever.
Okay.
I don't know if it fully. I mean, maybe it's not that it doesn't matter, but it's the.
I know. It's
but
not like the super important.
Yeah, no, but it is interesting because it's interesting language there. That it's like it seems like it's there, but it's like because it's the same pillar that like when eventually when the tabernacle is built, that this presence fills the tabernacle. It's understood that it's the presence of God, and physically what that looks like and how that manifests, you could debate a lot about.
Okay.
And so the presence of God is in this pillar. And so isn't there, not that movies are correct all the time, but I think there's a movie there's somewhere that like almost represents this pillar as with a face in it. As like that there's this person. Like there's a lot of
Charlton Heston one.
I don't know. But there's like this interesting, like, because there's some interesting things, because it's like even like later, like when there's this rock, in 1 Corinthians when it talks, I think it's 1 Corinthians, it talks about this rock that follows them, and it says the rock is Yeshua. It's like, so wait, is the rock a man? Like, like it's like we don't really know what to do with all of these, like but it's common to use language and depictions of God like showing up in nature, which is a lot of what's happening in these stories. Is the presence is God taking sovereignty over creation and using it to carry out some of these miracles. So it's an interesting question. I don't have a great answer for you because the language is interesting there. That it's like because it does say that the angel and also the pillar of cloud.
I just tend to be super literal. So
yeah.
I can read that thing in 1 Corinthians.
And I think my brain just like puts it together that it's like the presence of God in the pillar, and they just move together. But I don't know. So yeah, maybe
they were just trying to be extra clear and precise.
Mm-hmm.
Like both the Lord and His presence and the cloud all together.
Yeah. I think that's.
So what is that phrase that Tom says like? It's literary, it's not literal. I tend to be so literal.
Yeah.
So I was trying to remember.
Yeah, because I think there's a lot of well, we'll get into, the Song of Moses. Like there's a lot of literary like language, description and some kind of creative explanation, presentation of the story. And it is I think it is meant to be dramatic. And I'm not saying that it's not recording what happened accurately, but part of part of the point of the Exodus story is for it to be remembered, right? And you remember the stories with all the dramatic details and think, like this dramatic demonstration of God's power. And so I do think that there's Hillary's saying, like this overemphasis of things to be like, no, this is like the Lord is delivering them.
Sorry, guys.
No, you're fine. No, that's good. That's good. So yeah, because one of the things that's happening here, and what's interesting is like as you read commentaries, what came up at least for me, kind of time and time again, is just this connection with this deliverance through the sea as this creation parallel of. It's connecting to this pattern that we see of God coming and bringing deliverance through water and His Spirit, or the wind, because ruach, this word ruach shows up and it can be translated spirit or wind, kind of depending on which. But we see, in creation, of course, the Spirit hovers over the water. He starts creating order from chaos, and separating the water is one of the first things. And then we get to the Noah story, and the Spirit. It says that at the end of the flood that the spirit of the wind blows back the waters after the flood, and it's kind of this new beginning for humanity. And then we have this Exodus, and after Israel goes through, then Moses Moses stretches out his hand again, and the waters come back, and it's this wind or this spirit that brings the waters back over to kind of defeat the Egyptians, and it's this new start for Israel as the people of God. So it's kind of this pattern of the spirit coming over the waters onto this new beginning of humanity, and we see that in these different ways. And I was reading I think this was from Robert Alter's commentary, but it's talking about even like we see that, and we look back and see this as a pattern of immersion, of coming through water, right, of new life coming through water. And even in this commentary, which is Jewish commentary, he's not it's a Jewish scholar, but he's not a believer in Yeshua. He even equates this story to this kind of like birth imagery. Mm-hmm. And he says the passage through the waters, led by a man who has been saved from water after a genocidal decree in which water was to be the means of killing the babies, is the beginning of the birth of a nation. And he kind of sets this up as this larger narrative from Exodus through Numbers is kind of the biography of this nation of Israel, and this is the birth story of it. So it's really interesting, and there's like if you kind of stop to think about some of all the different water references in this, it's really, really interesting. All these different connections to creation, and even just Moses, like it's saying like that was really sticking out to me. Of like Moses was supposed to be drowned, right? He was supposed to be killed, and he wasn't. You know,
Doesn't
like
his name even mean to draw out of the waters?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so it's like, and so the Lord is consistent in this pattern of bringing, of kind of birthing new life out of the waters, which I find really interesting. And it just even makes me think, you know, if you go through, and that's what we say, right, when we immerse someone when they are confessing their belief in Yeshua, is that it's a new life. They're, you know, but a lot of the times the phrasing, you get like dead to your life of sin and raised to new life in Messiah. It's like some of the phrasing that I've always heard with baptisms and things like that. And so it's this new birth through water, and that goes even back to this entire nation of people of Israel, which I think is really pretty cool. And so at the end of chapter 14, we have this, it says, when Israel saw the great work that Adonai did over the Egyptians, the people feared Adonai, and they believed in Adonai and his servant Moses. So last week, Susan was making the point that as they're coming out of, as God is sending all these plagues on the Egyptians and they're about to come out of Egypt, that what they need is they need to see the power of God, because they're this greatly oppressed people, and they need to see that their God is going to deliver them. So we talk about the goodness and the kindness of the Lord, which we see, and I think we start to see it more of in this portion. But what they actually need to initially be able to trust and follow him is that they need to see this demonstration of his power over these other Egyptian gods, right? Because this is a time frame when whose God is more powerful is what wins the day. So they need to see that God is more powerful than the Egyptians, and that he's going to do what he says. And so I think it's interesting. So I just thought it was interesting that it kind of brings up this, that they've seen this great power of God, and that they're able to fear and believe him and trust Moses. And it even comes out as we look in. We won't go through the entire Song of Moses, though I love it. I love the Song of Moses. But at the beginning it even says, I will sing to Adonai, for he is highly exalted, the horse and its rider he is thrown into the sea. Adonai is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. So again, it's like this power and strength of the Lord that is what is drawing their allegiance at this point. And it talks about him being this warrior, and kind of recounting this his power in defeating the Egyptians. And then skipping down to, but then it shows his kindness as well, because skipping down to verse 13 of chapter 15, you in your loving kindness led your people led the people you have redeemed. You guided them in your strength to your holy habitation. So that there we have kind of the loving kindness of God and the strength of God to your holy habitation, which is interesting. There's several allusions in this portion to Sinai or to the tabernacle, depending on how you want to look at it or which reference it is. But it's like to your holy habitation. So this is kind of looking towards, when God is going to dwell. Of course, we don't have the tabernacle yet, but there's some allusion to that. And again, down in verse 17, you bring them in and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, the place, Adonai, that you have made yourself to dwell in the sanctuary, Adonai, which your hands have prepared. So it's possible that this was written down post tabernacle, and so there's some looking forward to that this is coming. But I think it's interesting that it's in there. That he is looking for this dwelling place, that he's going to continue to dwell with them, because of course he is currently dwelling in their midst in the wilderness, but he's going to continue to do that. Okay, we'll pause there for a second. So any other thoughts about anything that we've talked about so far in the Song of Moses, and anything else that sticks out in there before we move into some of these complainings and miracles in the wilderness? Okay, so we move on to chapter 15, now looking at verse 22. So now they have been delivered through the water, and they're in the wilderness, and they don't have any water, which is interesting, right? So there's several interesting things about this. So first, kind of bigger picture, overarching thing, we see a lot of, we mentioned it a little bit, but a lot of these interactions with the Lord and these miracles occurring kind of through nature. So the parting of the Red Sea, we have bitter water made sweet, they have manna that they eat every day and somehow miraculously doubles on the sixth day, so they don't have to collect it on Shabbat. And then we have water from the rock. And then even at the very end, the defeat of the Amalekites, which is not so much of nature, but the military power, which connects into what we're starting to see Israel as kind of having some military presence. But for these other miracles, all involve nature. There's these common threads. So they have this. They all begin because Israel is complaining. Or an interesting comment about that is that this complaining, or Robert Alter prefers murmuring, and he also says that expressing resentment is kind of a good translation of that verb. So, which is, I think, is true, huh?
Why? What's the difference?
He doesn't think that complaining is. He thinks that complaining is too casual of a word for it. It's more of this, like, I think the resentment is a helpful thing, because it's not that they're just whining about their situation. They're like resenting Moses and the Lord for bringing them out, and they're asking in all these times to go back to Egypt, which is like, are you crazy?
Mm-hmm.
But
so basically, complaining is too light of a word for what was going on in their hearts.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't complain casually.
Well, others do.
This is true.
I believe that. I believe that about you. Yeah, but anyway, all these situations all have this, like, they're kind of resenting Moses or resenting the Lord, which you could argue at this point is essentially the same thing, because Moses is very much representing the Lord to these people. And so all of these yeah, so they all have this resentment in place, and they all have the Lord. We have the Lord's response in a few different ways, so we'll kind of go through some of those. So, but what's interesting is, and this is what always catches us, and this is what I've been thinking about this week, as far as like, what do we learn about the Lord's character and how he relates with people? Because we have all these situations, and really, so they've just come out and they're in the wilderness and they don't have any water, and eventually they don't have any food. And like we mentioned, like their life in slavery in Egypt, they did at least have food and water. That they didn't really have to worry about that. So this is kind of maybe a newer concern. And it's also reasonable to need your basic needs to be met. So if they're wandering in the wilderness, remember, following the cloud, so they're going where the Lord is and there's no water, it's reasonable to be like, we need water. We're going to die. We need water. That's a reasonable request, is to have water to drink.
But it's also, I was thinking about this yesterday, like it's also, there's a difference between like having, like it's reasonable to think this in a situation, but then like the spirit, like the enemy comes at you and tells you like that's the truth, and like brings like a spirit of fear. There's like,
yeah.
And it could be like a legitimate thing that you need or are worried about or whatever, but then just like, it's like on steroids then, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, something is clearly going on here because, I guess in this one, they don't specifically say we should have stayed in Egypt, but the other ones, they do. So there's definitely something going on here that all of a sudden they're out of Egypt, they've had this dramatic deliverance and seen the Lord work in powerful ways, and then they're like, we should go back. Like, so something has shifted in their perspective to all of a sudden think that this is better. So yeah, I think there's definitely something else at play here. And it's also another way, or this is how the Lord is choosing to demonstrate his continued presence and faithfulness with them, and we start to see his goodness and his kindness and his care for them, and starting to build this relationship of, I'm not just a distant, powerful God. I'm the God who's with you and provides for you as you need it.
Also, I mean, it kind of shows their relationship with him and the fact that it's they don't just say, hey God, could we have some water? You know? Or could we have something to eat? Instead, it's almost like they presume that that he's not going to do this. So this anger immediately or whatever comes up in them, rather, it never says that they approach him properly to just ask him for their needs.
Right.
Instead, they cry out, they grumble, they complain. So we're kind of seeing like this mentality that they've got within them of not trusting that all they have to do is ask and they'll receive.
It seems like that kind of attitude would be a natural response after 400 years of being an enslaved people group, and having no rights, and always knowing that you can be abused at any minute, for any reason, and that the odds are always against you. You'll always be blamed. You'll never be heard. You'll never be respected. I don't know.
Yeah.
Like that kind of mentality may be hard. Maybe some of what God is trying to work out of them is just to teach them to receive and to love, and that there is such a thing as like a good authority that brings life and health. I don't know.
Right. I was just even thinking like that's a natural human tendency. Like we were joking about my best friend's 5-year-old who like
do all these things.
I read a book to her, I played with her, I watched a movie, and then we took her to ice cream and she cried about it, and I was like, what is wrong with your life? Like, and she was having trouble. Like, we're trying to teach her right now, like, well, would you tell us what's wrong, because maybe we could fix it if you ask nicely. Like, Aunt Panda is very willing to say yes, but if you just sob when I bring you to ice cream. Like, so I just think that might be a natural human tendency to just not know how to ask. Like, it's maturity to be like, this is what I need. Could you please give it to me?
Well, they not only had that incorrect attitude, but also, if you see in the next chapter there, they were blaming Moses, not blaming God.
Right.
They were complaining the wrong way.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I think yeah, everything that's coming out here is I think what's happening. I kind of look at this as like the people of Israel are like toddlers at this point
Yeah.
in their maturity, which makes sense.
Yeah.
Like again, like I feel like I like every year have like wrestled through layers of this with the Lord of being like, these people have your manifest presence in them. Why are they having such a hard time like trusting you and being obedient? And he's like, well, think about this. I'm like, okay. So the Lord tells me different things about it sometimes, but it's like, but because again, yeah, like we're saying, like they've been in slavery, and so they've been, you know, their mentality is like, you know, at the whim of the taskmaster, so to speak, they can abandon us, they can punish us, they can do whatever they want, right? For no reason, and they don't have the personal relationship with the Lord. We don't really know. You know, we've had a long period of time to where we know that there's some understanding of the Lord. Like they're wanting to worship Him, and there's something there's some form of allegiance to the Lord happening in Egypt, because that's what makes this whole story play out, right? Is that their allegiance is to Adonai and not to Pharaoh. But we don't know practically what that has looked like. And so now we're to this point, because of course even Moses, like he knew enough to, when there's a bush that's burning that's not burning up, should pay attention to this, and he, you know, and he understands the holiness of God in that moment as they're interacting. But again, we don't know the day-to-day interaction. We don't know what worship has looked like, and we don't know what's been going on here. And so this is a new level of relationship and reality of life following the Lord. And so it makes sense that because of the state of oppression, that they couldn't even really hear what Moses was saying when he's telling them of the deliverance that's coming. So now that this has happened, but now they're like, okay, we're out, now what? We're still in the wilderness. We don't know how to live outside of slavery. It's kind of that analogy of like a bird that's always lived in a cage will stay in the cage because it's safer. Like in some level, like if bondage is all you've ever known, some people will choose to stay there. And so I think there's this maturity level that is coming out here of like, which is not their fault. Again, like this is not actually the Israelites being super immature or something like that. This is them being like, we don't understand what it's like to not be for generations in slavery. And so this is this process of the Lord building trust and building relationship with them. And I think His response, as you go through the story, even, you know, it beyond, through the rest of the wilderness and through the rest of history, I would suggest, as there's been more relationship built and more demonstration of His faithfulness, the consequences for not trusting Him increase as well, right? So it's this progressive revelation, and He responds at the appropriate level for the maturity that should be there. Okay. Where are we? Yeah, so another book I'm reading right now is called The Torah Story, and it's basically like a textbook going through the Torah. It's really interesting.
What is it called?
The Torah Story. But like just like we've been saying it, they are suggesting that the Israelites were not unusually weak in character, and that they're actually, the way this is playing out is meant to provoke us to look in the mirror and see where we are not trusting the faithfulness of the Lord, and to see our own grumbling, complaining, resentment. And I like that they said this, that the Israelites, they were chosen from humankind for humankind. So we talked about this before, like there's really this generosity of the Lord to write His story through humans that are very human. Because a lot of other kind of mythic stories, it's all about the gods and it's about their perfection, and it's, you know, there's not this relationship with humanity, but God chooses to write His story through humanity, which again, one of the points of the Torah is to demonstrate that the God of Israel is categorically different than any other God of any other nation. And one of the ways that He does that is by His deep relationship and choosing to have his name presented on the earth through humanity, through Israel in particular. So let's look a little bit about how the Lord, kind of based off of what we've been talking about, how the Lord kind of responds to these different aspects of the people complaining against him. So in this first one at the end of Exodus 15, there's this, if you obey, if you listen to the voice of the Lord, this is verse 26. He said, if you diligently listen to the voice of Adonai your God and do what is right in his eyes, pay attention to his mitzvot and keep all his decrees, I will put none of the diseases on you that I have put on the Egyptians, for I am Adonai who heals you. And this is kind of the connection with the bitter waters, that he heals the waters to make them sweet so they can drink them. So basically he's saying, if you obey, I will heal you. And it's also interesting, this comes up several times in several different commentaries, that there's, again, this is a kind of a miracle concerning water. We've already talked about some of the significance of water in the biblical narrative overall, but in this deliverance aspect. Because if you think back, the first plague in Egypt was turning the water to blood. So there was this water that you couldn't drink. It was this taking away this, water sustains life, of course, right? So it's taking away this sustaining life. And now this first kind of miracle in the wilderness after their deliverance is this providing water to have life. So there's this kind of reversal connection there. Moving on a little bit to the manna. So there's lots of things about the manna that are really interesting. We won't have time to talk about all of them. So this is, of course, where they do say that if they had died in Egypt by pots of meat when we ate bread until we were full. So this is this different, yeah.
I find that hard to believe.
I know, right? Right. They may have had food provided for them, but I doubt that it was this lavish, feast that there seemed to be.
Seems like they really wanted to keep their costs low.
Yeah.
In the budget of
Right.
building their empire.
Right. Yeah. But the accusation, but you have brought us into the wilderness to kill this entire congregation with hunger. So yes, they're complaining at this point to Moses and Aaron, but at this point in the narrative, it's kind of the same as complaining against the Lord, because their understanding of the Lord has how the Lord speaks through Moses at this point. So then the Lord says, "I will rain bread on you from heaven." Great. And we have all this instruction about gathering a day's portion and all of this thing. What I think another thing I think is really interesting is in verse 4, where he says, "I will rain bread from heaven for you. The people will go out and gather a day's portion every day so that I can test them to find out whether they will walk according to my Torah or not." So the Torah has not actually been given. They are not to Sinai yet, so they have not actually gotten the Torah yet, but there's still reference to it. They have received instruction along the way. So there are things that they know that they're supposed to do, even Sabbath, which goes back to creation, that they know they're supposed to do. But I think it's interesting that it says, so that the Lord is testing them. So this series of events is also, it's the Lord testing the people and the people testing the Lord, which we see happen for the rest of the story, right? There's always this testing that's going on, but I think it's interesting that it's pointing out that it's testing the hearts of the people, because this is something that's like, he's telling them that he's going to give them bread every day. And he's like, he's testing to see where their maturity is at, basically, we could say, based on the conversation we've been having. And I think we could say that it's still quite low at this point.
And he uses that same language in the bitter waters made sweet as well. Like
Yes.
He said, and there he tested them.
Yes.
By
Yes.
telling them, listen to what I say.
Mm-hmm.
Very similar.
Yes. So we know that, and so of course we know that he does this, and that everyone gathers. They're told that he tells them, he's very specific, right? He's not being tricky in the instruction. That you are to gather according to your needs, an omer per person. I'm down in verse 16 of chapter 16 now. According to the number of people per household. And then it says, so they did so. Some gathered more, some gathered less. When they measured it with an omer, those who had gathered more had nothing left over, and those that had gathered less had no lack at all. So there's some level of like the Lord's trying to make a point here of like, I told you how much you need. So this is how much you get. And he tells them not to save it until morning. However, they did not listen. And some preserved it, and it bred worms and rotted. And so Moses was angry with them. Which makes sense, because at this point, remember, like Moses' maturity level is a little further ahead than everybody else's. And then we get into this whole thing, but they can gather double on the 6th day, and it doesn't rot. But the people still go out, and some still go out and try to gather it on Shabbat, right? And it's not there. And so this is very telling of the hearts of men, right? Is that God is being very specific and saying what he's going to provide and what they are to do, and they're not doing it. And we see this happen through the rest of Scripture. So again, this is pointing back to, like, we sometimes look at the Israelites in this, and we're like, they're so, like, how could they, that they're lacking so much maturity or something like that. And it's like, but I would invite each of us, myself included, because I've had these moments with the Lord, these correction moments with the Lord, where it's like, he's like, I said this. Why are you doing that? And so it's really just he's showing us the human condition. And we are really not so different. Yes, I think that overall, I would hope, generationally, you grow in maturity is the goal. And sometimes that goes better than others. You see it even play out, he tells Israel through the rest of the Torah, if you're faithful and you obey my commands, you'll stay in the land and all the blessings that will come. And if you don't, then all these things are going to come. And as you keep reading through the rest of the Tanakh, particularly getting into things like Kings and Chronicles, as you read through the different kings and the ones that are faithful and the ones that are not, you see it play out, right? You see the ones that are faithful and the blessings come, and the ones that aren't, and all the craziness happens up to and including Israel being cast out of the land. So we see this forever tension with the Lord of like, do you really believe that I am who I say I am? So the manna shows us a lot about that. And it also points to, again, going back to the question of like, why are you refusing to keep my Torah, keep my mitzvot? So very telling of the thought of the hearts of men. And so this also shows us something about the way the Lord, so the way the Lord interacts with humanity as far as like God, he's the God of all creation, right? And I think this was Robert Alter as well. I didn't write down the reference for some reason in my notes. He makes this point that God, even beginning in the garden, is one who offers humankind great abundance of gifts, but always stipulates restrictions to be observed in their enjoyment. So there's this, right? Because like in the garden, you can have anything you want, but this one tree. Here, it's like, I'm going to feed you every day, but you have to trust that I'm going to feed you every day, And so there's this tension, I think. I'd be interested to hear other people's comments about this too. There's this tension, right, between this trust in the God of all creation to give the abundance of that creation, to also having to be obedient and obey these restrictions unto, right? The unto what? Is the unto this trusting that he's going to continue to be faithful. Because really, because what is it saying about what they believe about God by him saying, collect this much every day and don't keep it overnight, that they're not doing that they're collecting, trying to collect more, which doesn't work, which I think is funny, and then trying to keep it overnight and it rots. It's like they're not trusting that the Lord's going to do what He says He's going to do, that He's going to continue to provide this, faithfully provide the sustaining life source, basically. And so there's this tension between, like, He's the God of all creation, He can give them anything He wants, but you have to trust Him, right? So anybody have any other thoughts, comments, perspectives on that?
Well, and it makes me think of a story that Heidi Baker shares about when she brings in kids that have been in massive poverty, and they're in the house, here's the food, here's everything, yet they'll have a tendency to steal or hoard, not trusting that, you know, it's right there for you. You can have a cookie anytime you want. I've set the cookie jar here in front of you, yet they're still hiding or stealing or hoarding. So it kind of shows that mentality of, I've had to do this for so long on my own, that it is a hard shift to actually trust that somebody else is going to take care of me.
Yeah.
So I can see where that wrestle, probably even as slaves, there were times that it's like they hoarded, or, you know, especially towards the end where I'm going to cut this supply and that supply because Pharaoh's mad at you. And so they go into that survival mode.
Right.
And so now I also think, as far as having a relationship with the Lord, that's probably never been modeled to them in Egypt. I mean, they worshipped these gods, but relationship's a totally different thing. And so, yeah, it is this progress where He is trying to work out this self-reliant, poverty, fleshly mode that they've probably always been in. And I can't see flipping the switch and the next day that's going to change. So this is a long process to hopefully the second generation sees and steps into that, because we know that first generation had their issues.
Right.
It still really disturbs me, you know, like for 40 years I loathed that generation type of mentality, but you know, you would really hope the children would learn from the parents on this.
Yeah, which it comes, like, that's part of the dynamic here too. I've heard it explained in this, like, going from, like, this mentality from slave to son, which is what you're describing, is that this poverty, slavery mentality is like, anything that I get, I have to, like you're saying, like, you have to hoard it, you have to hide it, I have to look out for myself because no one else is looking out for me. Whereas children of loving parents, right, don't behave that way. Jonathan David Helser talks about this sometimes. He talks about the father heart of God a lot. But he talks about, like, this, just the analogy of, like, his kids. He's like, it would actually break my heart if my kids walked into my house and came up and this very formal question of, like, may I please go into the refrigerator and have a snack? He's like, no, you just walk in the house and you go and get what you want, right? Like, it's this, because it's yours. It's, if you have this, you know, being a child of the father of the house, you know what's available and you go and take it because it's yours. And so it's this, but that's a you know, a son. And, you know, children who grow up in healthy homes, they have that mentality. Like, they walk in the door, they get what they need. They, you know, like, they know they can go in it wherever they want, and, you know, like,
if they have parents that allow them to do that.
Yeah, I mean, yes, but I mean, within the boundaries and the structure of the household, but it's not this, like, militant, like, you know, you have to stand in the corner until I tell you can go sit on the couch and read a book or something, you know, like, it's not this, it's, you know, it's not this slavery mindset that it's like, I have to protect everything I have and I have to perform in a certain way to receive honor or something like that. And so, yeah, it's taking this generational shift, which is even why, if you think about it, again, going back to, I made a comment earlier that's like, the Lord's response is in line with the level of maturity and relationship they have, right? So yes, the manna, if they keep it overnight, it rots. But that's not really going to harm their lives, right? It's not that he's like, if you keep it overnight, it's going to rot, and I'm not going to send it the next day, right? I think he's trying to build their faith of like, so you keep it overnight, it rots, you realize it's rotted, but you still go outside and there's fresh for you. You're still being provided for because he's demonstrating his faithfulness, right? So the consequence is in line with the level of trust and relationship that they have, is how I see it. I'm sure there's other ways to look at this too, but people like to point, like people, this is me coming against some of the narrative that the God of Israel in this time frame is really harsh and militant, and it's like actually he's really kind to them. Again, because it goes back to like he's shown his power by bringing them out, and now he is showing his kindness, which is something that they don't see from other gods of other nations. So seeing this kindness and the care from the Lord is something that's just completely a different construct than any other like little g God and human relationship they've ever seen around them as well.
I also like the fact that he's really highlighting to keep the Sabbath holy.
Yeah.
Too. I mean, it's like I've only really given you one thing so far,
right.
So let's get this one down. Let's keep this holy because it's really important, and it's something that's going to carry on forever.
Right.
You know, I mean, it's the statutes, the things that the Lord has to kind of drill into these people in this point in time are still things that these people, they're still observing it to this day. I mean, it's not like, oh, that was for then and we're going to just let, Shabbat go, or we're going to let, no, this is something that it was important then enough for him to say, this is the lesson I want you to learn.
Right.
And it's still important now. It's never stopped.
Right.
And so I mean, that's where with the constant remember and reminding and teaching and training, because this is something that's important that the Lord wants to be carried through for all generations. And this is how he had to first start teaching it.
Right, right. And not only that, which is very important, but it also is showing like you can't explain this miracle of the manna by anything other than God. Because what substance shows up every day and you rots overnight, except for this one day a week it doesn't. Yeah. Like that has to be the Lord, right? Like it has to be supernatural provision. And so yes, but it's also unto, and it's this again going back to demonstrating this faithfulness of like you're like this is an instruction that they've had because it was implemented at creation, the seventh day Sabbath, and he's even still demonstrating to this point like it's so important. I'm gonna provide extra for you because you have to observe this because this is one of the ways that God's God's name is presented in the earth and through his people is that they have this commandment. It's an identity issue of the Jewish people that they keep this Sabbath and what that looks like. So yeah, from early on, it shows this consistency. Like that's the only command they really have. They probably have some others as well, but this is the main thing that the Lord has told them to do is to keep this day holy. Like it has to show up in this story, right? Because it has to be consistent. What he's spoken before has to be consistent with what he's doing in the present time. It's really good. Any other thoughts, perspectives, questions?
I assume they weren't able to keep the Shabbat as
In Egypt?
slaves, right?
Probably
this
not.
is a new pattern for them in their lifestyle.
Yeah, I think so. I don't recall any reference that they keep the Shabbat in Egypt, but they would have known that it was a command.
I would think that if they have their animals with them as they went out of Egypt, they wouldn't need manna in the first place. And besides, if they have the animals, that's obviously they're not pet animals; they are for food, right? So who fed the animals? They cannot eat sand in the desert. So we have to look on the logistic things around it, not just by their complaint. If they complain for manna extra for the animals that they have, that's they are being very spoiled.
Well, but the animals are also their, I mean, that's also some of their wealth. Like that's like, they don't want to just, they have to keep their livestock. And they think that they're going, they at this point also don't know that they're not just traveling and going to the land. They don't know that they're going to spend 40 years in the wilderness. So they're thinking they're going to go establish their homes and that this is going to be their,
So what good
their livelihood.
what good the gold will have to be in the desert? There's no bank or nobody can merchant with
But they
gold.
think that they're going to the land. So they think that they're going to have to,
And in the land
they're going to encounter other people. So maybe this is a,
Okay.
trying to negotiate with the people. I don't know. There's a lot we don't know, but there's a lot of speculation here. But the point is, like, yes, they could eat some of their animals, and maybe they did some of that, but they don't want that to be their only source of food, because then they're going to have no livestock. And they're shepherds. There's the shepherding
So
people.
they
They're
have
planning on the
ground
shepherds
for
to
manna
be.
and food for the animals too.
Yeah.
I never thought of that before. Do the animals eat manna too?
Maybe. They might have.
It's those details they
I
don't
know.
tell
They
us.
don't tell us. They don't give
But
us all the details.
in reality, how many days' journey would it actually have been if they weren't wandering for 40 years?
I don't remember now. I have looked at that. It's like a couple of weeks, I think.
Yeah. So they had no expectation of
Yeah.
camping out for 40 years in the wilderness. And because of things that happened, they did. So, but yeah, I'm sure when they left, it was like, okay, now we're going to go and live in this desert for 40 years. That was never on their minds. That wasn't even on Moses' mind. But yeah, I've always wondered things like, what did they trade when they started the sacrificial system, and how did they get stuff? Yes, they plundered Egypt, but there's still like the practical things on that we aren't given the details of, but they're really fun to guess about.
I was just thinking, like, they do know they're going to the desert originally to sacrifice to God, so like they cannot deplete. Besides being shepherds, they can't deplete their livestock because they need it to be able to do sacrifices.
Yeah. So I think, and also going back to what we're saying is they have a slavery mentality, and the livestock is what's theirs. So they're not wanting to. I think the list is long of reasons they don't want to just be going through and using all their livestock for food through the wilderness, because it's going to put them in if they go through it, they kill all their animals to eat, it's gonna have some negative consequences regardless of what the purpose is for them, whether it's the sacrificing or the as their livelihood, basically.
A good shepherd can monitor his budget, food, and the next babies to be born.
Right. But they don't know. But they're also they're now moving. They're used to they've lived in the same place for 400 years. And now they're traveling. And they're not, they don't know what they're coming, they don't know what's ahead of them. And so I think they don't know, I don't know. And I think, we can speculate about it, and yes, maybe they could have done that. I don't think but I think it's also, I think it's showing God's desire to sustain them also. And because he meets their requests, he could have answered back to Moses and saying, you have livestock. He could have gone that way. He could have said, kill and eat your livestock. And the Lord could have been faithful even in the reproduction and the multiplication of their livestock to sustain them. He could have done it that way. But this is how, and there's all kinds of details that we don't know, and all kinds of situations we don't know, and all kinds of practicals that we don't know. But we know that this is how God chose to sustain them.
So it's good that slaves can own stocks. So it's not really slavery, it's just
it's not
for food.
Yeah.
Because we know they own that stuff, because when they were in Goshen, their cattle wasn't killed. During the plague.
Right.
There's, you know,
Right.
there was
I
a
mean-
preservation, so they did own some stuff.
Yeah. I mean, their multiplication and their accumulation of livestock basically is what got them in the situation in the first place. Because the Egyptians were like, hold on. These people are becoming too numerous and they're doing too well. They're going to become too powerful for us. So that was actually the start of the problem to begin with.
They also could have had a worst case scenario mentality.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not hungry yet, but I am going to be hungry, and this is going to be God's fault, or I'm not, you know, I mean, and I'm really like guilty of this. When I see certain things, I had to really train myself not to go to the worst case scenario and just wait and see. But a lot of times you already assume the worst is going to happen when it might not, and there could be that kind of mentality too. Yeah, the water's bitter. That doesn't mean they didn't have any actual, it doesn't say that they were thirsty beyond whatever, or that they were starving to death at this point in time. They just get there and it's like, there's no food for us. There's no water for us. We're just gonna die, you know? I mean, it's, and it's, like I said, instead of asking too, they immediately get mad at God or mad at Moses about this, because it isn't what they wanted. It isn't what they expected. So we're gonna direct our anger at somebody about this.
Yeah.
It's a good point. It's biblical that to him who is hungry, every bitter thing tastes sweet. So if you're thirsty enough, you may drink that bitter water. It's all you had.
Yeah. And I think this is the beginning of a process of an identity shift.
Yeah.
Right? This is what we've been talking about. Is they're coming out of slavery. So it's this process of identity shift from slave to sons or heirs.
Fine line.
And I think that part of what that looks like is this process of provision and yeah. So it takes time, and it's this identity shift, and this is part of the process of seeing that shift come about. Well, we are out of time. So just briefly, we didn't get to these last couple of miracles, but just briefly, a couple of comments. We get to the again, they're asking for water. And this is the rock that Moses strikes, and this is the one that's referenced in Corinthians, that it talks about this rock that follows them around and then provides water, and the rock is Yeshua. And no one understands what that means.
When you measure this big rock with these tiny little.
I know, right? It does make you it makes me think of a cartoon, because my brain is like, I don't know what to do with this. Did somebody carry it around? Did they build a cart for it? What happened? Anyway. But Moses strikes the rock, and again, it's this, he strikes it with this same staff that he used to he raised the staff to part the Red Sea, that then came back over the Egyptians and brought the defeat of the Egyptians, now brings forth water and life for the people of Israel. And then we don't have time to talk about it, but this last little story where they go and they fight the Amalekites. And of course, we have God's miraculous intervention here, that as long as Moses' arms are held up, that they are victorious. But we see Joshua already as a military leader. So he had an early and long military career. This is also, and this is the first, and in verse 13 of chapter 17, it says, so Joshua overpowered the Amalekites with his army with the edge of the sword. So this is also the first kind of instance where we see the Israelites going out to fight. Yes, God is, like we said, God is still very much involved in and it's a miraculous victory, but they are actually going out and fighting, and it's not this just watch the Lord come through for you. It's this almost, I would suggest this partnering with the Lord to bring the victory. So we will stop there. So it was a good conversation. I think this portion, like I said, I really enjoy this portion. I think it's really interesting to see, even though we don't have all the practicals, and some of it is a bit hard to explain. I think that the takeaway that I hope that we get is that we see like the Lord's desire to provide and to shift this mindset out of slavery and into sonship, I would say, and that He is going to be faithful to them, and this is His demonstration of the faithfulness that He promised to Abraham is playing out in this deliverance from the Exodus. So, Lord, we thank You for we thank You for Shabbat. We thank You for this opportunity to come together and study Your word and to learn from Your Torah, to learn from the way that You have interacted in this Exodus story, and that you've interacted with Your people, and continue to demonstrate the same faithfulness and loving kindness and power to us today, Lord. So we just ask that Your presence would be with us through the rest of Shabbat and through our service together, Lord. And we thank You that we get to come together and worship You, and enjoy this Shabbat that You've created and called Your people to through all of history, Lord. So we also just ask that You would be with the team in Ethiopia, whatever they're doing right now, and that as they're serving and ministering in Your name, Lord, that You would bless them and that You would be present with them as well, Lord. Amen.